Russian President Vladimir Putin has threatened to retaliate against Ukraine's use of U.S.-made ATACMS missiles on Russian soil by using Russian-made Oreshnik missiles on Kiev. These are hypersonic weapons that the Russians claim cannot be shot down by any existing air defense systems in Ukraine presently. Now, it's unclear as to whether or not this is true because the Ukrainians claim that this is complete fiction. The Oreshnik missiles don't actually exist, they claim. So what's next for Ukraine and Russia in the war? We'll also be talking about the recent ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel brokered by the U.S., and we'll talk about the trade wars. President-elect Donald Trump has vowed to amp up tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. So how will these countries retaliate, and what's next for the global economy? Pyotr Kurzin is here to discuss these themes with us. He is the host of the Global Gambit, very popular geopolitical YouTube channel, linked down below. He's also a geopolitical analyst. Welcome back to the show, Pyotr. Always good to see you.
Yeah, and you, my friend. It's really good to see you. And well, I wish it was in better circumstances, but here we are. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, Pyotr, lots of things to discuss. Arguably good news for the Middle East is one step closer to peace, but bad news in Ukraine as things don't seem to be slowing down in terms of escalation. Let's talk about what Putin plans to do next. Take a look at my screen. Take a look at this clip of Putin making an announcement just 2 days ago, and then we can respond together.
На продолжающиеся удары по территории России ракетами большой дальности западного производства, как уже было сказано, мы будем отвечать, в том числе и возможным продолжением испытания Орешника в боевых условиях, как это было сделано 21 ноября. В настоящее время Министерство обороны и Генеральный штаб российской армии подбирают цели для поражения на территории Украины. Это могут быть военные объекты, предприятия оборонной промышленности или центры принятия решений в Киеве.
All right, so unclear exactly as to what may happen next, but he has threatened to strike Kiev. Importantly, he later said that the missiles that he plans to use, the Oreshnik missiles, don't have any nuclear warheads currently, but the kinetic energy, the Russians claim, of these missiles alone could level entire blocks. It could crater the city, actually create literal craters, they warned. Anyway, what's your take on what is currently happening? Is this bluster from Putin, or will he actually carry through with striking Ukraine, Kiev rather, with the latest missiles?
Well, where to start? I think that to contextualize what we've seen in the past a month alone, let alone the whole past couple of years, is we are on an escalatory ladder, David. And you know me for the times that I've been on previously where I don't like to overhype things. I'm not a sensationalist, but this is serious. And the severity of what we're seeing in the sense that this is now where the US, the UK and France, all nuclear capable partners, are willing to allow Ukraine to use their missiles and such into Russian territory. And this was always considered something that the West would never do. And now here we are. But this also reveals that a lot of the rhetoric, to use your word, bluster, by the Kremlin is sometimes that. I don't think we should ever underestimate what Russia might be willing to do, or more specifically Putin. But it does show that sometimes when you push that a little bit further, how much is Russia willing to do it? Now, these Oreshnik missiles are what you call intermediate range ballistic missiles, or IRBMs. Now, Kiev has immediately denounced these and said that they're nothing more than sort of lower level or sort of simplified intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. But the point is that they are very damaging, at least what Putin says. So half the war is about optics, half the war is about war of wording and who can frame things from a sense to as much each other, but also the rest of the international community. Don't forget how much Russia is dependent on North Korea, on China, on a various amount of other countries to sustain its war. This isn't just Russia versus the West and the West supporting Ukraine. Russia is increasingly reliant and engaged with other countries for its war campaign. So when Putin makes statements like these, I don't think we should dismiss it, but equally it's the extent to which he's willing to do that in terms of, you mentioned striking Kiev. Now, Kiev has been hit quite a few times, or attemptedly, and interceptions have been largely very successful. Other areas of the country, not so much, but that's because the systems that the West has provided are not placed everywhere. So this is when he says the weapon is, quote, comparable in strength to a nuclear strike. I wouldn't see that as such. But a lot of people who've been watching Ukraine for a long time have always been concerned, including myself, about the propensity to use a tactical nuke. I'm not going to go too much into that rabbit hole, because we've heard the West worry about this and Russia claim that they could use it at any one point, and they've not followed through. So a lot of this is saber rattling. A lot of it is, though, also Putin really trying to emphasize we are responding to what we see as Western escalation, right? We're using these intensified missiles because the West has made its choices. And you can also, last point I would say, is that revisement of the nuclear doctrine by the Kremlin. Now, you can argue that again doesn't necessarily mean much is going to change, but the fact that they now explicitly state that a nuclear capable power will be held as accountable as a country that utilizes any weapons by said nuclear power, i.e. Ukraine using weapons by the US, UK or France, sees them as directly engaged in the war. That is, it's worth noting for sure. And I can understand the very sentiments shared by many people about, potential, well, I hate to use it, but World War III kind of rhetoric.
I want to talk about the Oreshnik missile for just a minute. In Russia, it's supposedly called Oreshnik, meaning hazel tree. And I don't know why it was named that way. But anyway, Putin claims that, let me just take a look at this article here. Putin claims that the kinetic impact is powerful, like a meteorite falling. Importantly, it's a hypersonic missile. The Russians claim that there are currently no air defense systems in Ukraine that can shoot it down. The Ukrainians claim that this is bogus. There's no such thing as Oreshnik. The missile is simply a lightly modified version of existing Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles. The man has just come up with a name, just an abstract name. Okay, so anyway, we haven't seen it being used in action. Let's suppose that Putin is not he is not bluffing, that these are hypersonic missiles, that these cannot be shot down. He also last week just threatened to nuke NATO because of what happened with the attack and missile strikes into Russia. Is the West worried about this weapon?
It's difficult to tell because we've only really seen this sort of missile appear in the past few days. I certainly, as I say, I think there is caution and taking note, but sort of panic and, alarm bells or panic stations, not yet. To put it very simply, whatever you think of the war and whether you stand more aligned to Ukraine or Russia, Putin is still a actor who is not going to simply launch nuclear weapons, because he understands the ramifications that means, not merely for what the West would do in response, but what it means for the overall economic stability, right? China does not want Putin to do that. India doesn't want him to do that. Many non-aligned nations, right, who are unwilling to take sides will be very against that. Putin just hosted the BRICS summit. Is he really willing to risk such a sort of introduction into the international sphere, or a great optical moment for him? Because, the West is saying Russia is isolated, and it's clearly not, if you've got many countries joining, world leaders in Moscow. So it doesn't seem likely that he would really follow through on the text. That's why the tactical level is a little bit more concerning, because you could potentially do a symbolic strike, Simir, illustrate, as a pure posturing move, we are really serious now, but not actually strike, any civilian targets. But I would say the thing about this specific missile is that it's quite entertaining. It has kind of come out of nowhere. The name is a bit random. I agree with you. But my other favorite thing about it is that some Russian families have actually been taking it and adopting it as a name for their children.
I read that.
So So it shows you the trickle down effect of the Russian populace and how they look at this. But as you said, the Ukrainians, an advisor called Podolyak has already said, this is a fiction, of course, I think he was quoted as saying, and it's not really going to lead to anything in the grander scheme, the geopolitical, geostrategic direction of things. It's not probably going to make too much of a difference.
Before we continue with the video, I want to share a unique way to diversify wealth with art. According to Deloitte, the art and collectibles wealth held by ultra-high net worth individuals could reach $2.9 trillion by 2026. Earlier this year, Bank of America reported that 83% of multimillionaires under 43 are already collecting art or looking to add to it to their portfolios. That's where today's sponsor, Masterworks, comes in. They make it possible to invest in shares of high-value, blue-chip contemporary art without needing millions or deep expertise. So far, Masterworks has returned over $60 million to investors across 23 exits. With the art market currently at lower price points, it's a rare entry opportunity. In fact, Masterworks recently sold a Basquiat piece earlier this year for $8 million, delivering another profitable return. Scan the QR code here on the screen or go to masterworks.art/David Lin and the link down below to skip the waitlist and get priority access today. I wonder if it would prompt the Americans to send more weapons to Ukraine before the inauguration of Donald Trump. Let's take a look at this statement from Secretary of State Blinken. He made this statement recently.
As we're working to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to effectively defend itself, the United States continues to step up. We've obligated just recently and pushed out the door another $8 billion in security assistance for Ukraine. That was in September. Another almost $500 million just a few weeks ago. And President Biden is committed to making sure that every dollar we have at our disposal will be pushed out the door between now and January 20th.
What do you think is the game plan of the Americans right now?
I was reading an article relatively recently. It was in a different context relating to APEC, which is the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation. And, you know, Biden attended, but he wasn't just seen as a lame duck. He was seen as a super lame duck president, which essentially means that no one was really paying much attention to him. And so I think by extension, he knows that limited focus is on his last couple of months. Much attention is on preparation and precautionary measures, if you're Europe for trading reasons, for example, on Trump. And I think that the Biden administration's approach is relatively simple, which is that they want to maximize what they can give to Ukraine, to maximize what they can get in the sense of territorial or just advantageous gains, be that physical or not, before Trump takes office and really begins to pressure for some kind of peace talks to begin. Obviously, he's not going to do it in 24 hours, and I'm not going to humor that, but it's about trying to ensure Kiev is in the best place it can be before January 20th in the inauguration, and then Trump really begins putting that into place. I would point out that the gentleman, is it Romney? I forget the gentleman who's been nominated as his general to take care of it, of Ukraine, has basically said that, you know, he hasn't said anything too Kellogg, excuse me, what am I saying? Keith Kellogg. Kellogg has basically not said anything too pro-Kremlin or sympathetic. So there are hopes that Trump will, you know, want to try to support Ukraine, but in a more minimalist sense. But I don't think Biden and the current administration are taking any chances. And that's why you're seeing them ramp up the aid.
Well, okay. Are there any final red lines that would really prompt Putin and his armed forces to take even more drastic actions in Ukraine? I mean, one supposed red line was already crossed. He stated very clearly he did not tolerate any long-range missiles or even intermediate-range missiles being sent into Russia. That line was crossed. And yet, here we are. He's threatening to use nukes and Oreshnik missiles and whatnot. Before January, which is still a month and a half away, what is possibly the final red line, theoretically speaking?
Well, the maximalist scenario, if you want to call it that, is obviously full NATO presence in Ukraine. You know, you send troops in and you go straight to the front lines and you're fighting directly.
I mean, how likely is that had to happen before an inauguration?
No. Well, it's not happening regardless of how much time you wanted to
can you clarify that for us? Didn't the French talk about sending troops into Ukraine?
Yes, they have. Macron has said this a few times. The British and the French are talking about it even as we speak now, because we've obviously had a leadership change in the UK, which is more aligned to Europe than, say, the Conservatives were. But what they mean more is, because everything's a spectrum, right? You've got maximalist scenario whereby you've got troops fighting directly with Russia, as I said, and you've got minimalist or non-existent, which is no one is supporting Ukraine at all. This one is sort of along, if this is the middle point, you've got sort of 70%, right? So the UK French sort of idea is to send troops in to act as sort of more crisis management, humanitarian support advisors in areas of around Kiev and Western Ukraine, but go nowhere near in terms of a combatant role. They would not be partaking in fighting, which, would that trigger Moscow to respond with some kind of heightened set of missiles against European capitals? I highly doubt it, but they probably would. What they tend to do, what Putin tends to do, is respond with blanketing indiscriminate strikes across the whole of the country. So you would certainly, I think, see a rise in rhetoric. Maybe he really does begin to utilize more of these hypersonics, as you mentioned earlier. The one caveat I would say to that is they're extremely expensive. And whilst the DoD came out with a report, I think a couple of years ago, saying that the US is nowhere near the level of progress in advancement of this technology as, say, China or Russia, it's still unlikely that the Russians want to use it on a frequency that they are suggesting they might. So I would probably, the biggest red line, I think, would be more troops getting more involved in potential conflict roles.
Okay.
But I still just don't think that's going to happen at this point.
Well, let's assume status quo until January. Trump said...
Well, that's just, if I can add one last point, which is, if you saw news a couple of days ago, the American government have basically said, Ukraine, you need to lower your conscription level to 18. So that, I think, is indicative that they want Ukraine to, and people will obviously say, well, this is the Americans sending the Ukrainians into the meat grinder for American interests. And I completely understand that perspective. But that, I think, as I say, signals that there isn't a desire for more countries to get involved other than supporting Ukraine through, equipment, funding, and so on.
I'd like to turn now to talk about the potential relationship between Russia and the U.S. under Trump 2.0. Let's just take a quick listen to what Putin has said about Trump recently. We'll watch 30 seconds of this clip.
Разговаривали господин Трамп и господин действующий президент на своей встрече. Мы не знаем. И поэтому комментировать это не будем, это невозможно. Но возможны разные варианты. Если действующий президент Байден считает, что он, обостряя ситуацию, повышая градус конфронтации, создает условия для будущей администрации легко выйти из этой ситуации, потому что вновь избранный президент скажет, это не я, это же там люди, которые вообще из ума выжили, все, я к этому не имею отношения. Давайте поговорим. Конечно, это вариант. Первое. Второе. Таких заявлений могут делать только безответственные. Возможно, версия, что они, действующая администрация, хочет...
Is he right? Is he right that Biden's administration is just trying to make Trump's life more difficult? Is there truth in that?
Yeah, I think there is, and before people go absolutely ballistic because they've heard someone sort of say, yeah, there's some truth to what Putin just said, but I think there is a degree of wanting to make Ukraine so much supported, or the US is so that far in at this point that it's harder to really roll back as much as Trump wants to do. What I did want to mention in the broader scheme of this sort of dynamics between Trump and Putin, because it's as much about their personal relationship as the bilateral diplomatic one, is that it's been very clearly indicated, I think, by Trump that if he feels at any point Putin is taking him for a ride or not really going to be genuine in considering negotiations, he will reverse course and he will upscale support. We'll come to this later on, but obviously Trump wants to reduce the deficit of the US, but at the same time he wants to increase funding for the military. He did this by $200 billion in the first term he was president. So, that obviously is going to be interesting to see how he manages, but he will be willing to spend extra to take on issues like Iran, Russia, if he's not felt like he's getting what he wants. He is a transactionalist in the way that he conducts foreign policy. And I think that the relationship with Russia in any preliminary negotiations around peace in Ukraine will become evident. For me, I think, also you can see the way that he talks about it. He thinks that Trump will not want to be associated with the previous administration at all, at least when it comes to Ukraine. I agree very much. In the Middle East, which we'll touch upon, is more complicated, I think, a little bit. China's the most complicated, but Ukraine is pretty simple. Trump wants out of that. He wants Europe to take the lead. Europe should be doing more. I agree with him on that as well. But generally speaking, and it's very interesting if you watch further into that clip, he goes on to talk about, how it's a mess for the US. The US is in a terminal decline, and he reframes it to talk about how Russia is really the country that's got it more sort of organically correct. And I think that this is also going to be a huge theme that underpins the Trump Putin relationship.
Okay, so this is important. Let me just play 10 seconds of this. He praised Trump. Take a listen.
Вновь избранного президента. Он все-таки человек умный, и достаточно уже опытный. Он, мне кажется, найдет решение. Тем более после того, как он прошел такое, скажем, очень серьезное испытание.
All right, so Putin called Trump a smart person, already quite experienced, and he will find a solution. Okay, let's talk about this solution. Trump has said that he wants to end the Ukraine war on day one. He said this several times on the campaign trail. How likely is this to happen? I'm starting to suspect that there are one of two possibilities. Either he's already talked to Putin about a potential solution, and number two, things will just derail completely before January, and he's going to have to push that timeline out.
Well, yeah, I mean, David, I mean, there's a basic fundamental aspect which people who don't deal in diplomacy don't seem to comprehend. A lot of the people on X who pretend to be experts will sort of say that, well, he can negotiate and secure a ceasefire in 24 hours. These two haven't even begun talking, let alone nearing a point of actual agreement. You need to get them in the room first, and we haven't even got to that point. So, no, he's not going to do anything in 24, 48, 72 hours. I don't really care how many hours you're talking about. It's going to be longer than a week.
Well, what would the solution look like, Pyotr? What would this compromise, this deal?
I covered that on my channel in a video, which is JD Vance, his vice president, has suggested the idea of a DMZ. So DMZ, demilitarized zone, obviously the most infamous one being the Koreas. The problem with this is a few things. One, just pragmatically, the DMZ in Korea, I think it's like 800 kilometers. I can't remember the exact amount. In the Ukrainian situation, it's more than double that. Okay, so that's pragmatic. You've got to have a massively securitized border zone with fences and surveillance and such. Second, who's going to manage it? Is it going to be the Americans? I don't think the Kremlin's going to be okay with that. So what, the UN? Well, can you see the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans agreeing on that with the Security Council? Not sure. It's not going to be NATO either. So what, an independent third party? Not sure who that would be. So how do you actually facilitate a DMZ is the question. Third, it's also just not really going to happen because of the unwillingness of either side to really agree to it. Aside from the details, would it go along the line of contact? Obviously, the Ukrainians will say no, it goes along the 91 borders where Putin hasn't, invaded and taken control of the oblast, the 4 oblasts. You've also got a couple of oblasts that are partially controlled, Kherson and Zaporizhia to be specific. Are they going to be carved up or are they going to be done along the actual lines? So this is where you will see that loggerheads of Putin and Trump come into fruition, because Putin's not going to, he wants his demands, he wants maximalist gains in that regard. Trump's not going to back down and being like this, why, and that. So I don't think it's going to go very far. The DMZ is just one option. Another one is just it becomes a frozen conflict. Nothing really happens. It just sort of is protracted and it's there, right? It just grinds on and the world adjusts and absorbs the fallout for it. The third is obviously the Trump just pulls out any and all support and the Russians gradually remobilize. Europe can't get its act together and eventually the Ukrainians just begin to buckle under the, sustained wartime economy of Russia, right? We can talk about the sustainability of Russia's war effort on its economy. If you look at the rate of rubles to dollars, as I was talking to you yesterday about, and just generally the debt crisis there is well, it's not going well, put it that way. It's overheating the economy. But in terms of sustaining the war front and being able to overwhelm the Ukrainians longer term, just because Russia's a bigger entity, quite possibly. But I don't think that's as likely as some kind of pause, whatever that would look like. That this is probably the hardest aspect of any of, trying to war game or conject over what could happen next.
Let's shift gears now to talk about the Middle East. Earlier this week, Israel and Lebanon agreed to a ceasefire. This U.S. brokered deal set that 60 days, Israeli troops have 60 days to pull their troops out. What is this 60 days? Is it just a temporary ceasefire? Is it the end of the war? Are they going to resume fighting after 60? What's going on?
Well, they've already reinitiated
look at this.
combat.
Look at this headline. They're already blaming each other as to who is violating who in the ceasefire. Some the Israelis are blaming Hezbollah. The Lebanese are blaming Israel for violating. Anyway, yeah. So
I think you've partially answered your own question. Is I guess what I would say. It's complicated because Lebanon has multiple factions. You've got Hezbollah, you've got the Lebanese government itself, you've got UNIFIL, which is the UN mission there, which is supposed to sustain this peace, and then you've got obviously the IDF. So this peace agreement, this ceasefire, was brokered on Wednesday. It came into force early on Wednesday, but Israel began striking again southern parts of Lebanon because they claim that Hezbollah was violating the ceasefire. Now, we can talk about whether or not Israel should have conducted its war into Lebanon as well. That's my biggest concern, which is the Lebanese people stuck in the middle of all of this.
Yeah,
I don't personally think that Israel really wants to continue some kind of conflict up there. They have achieved arguably more in terms of beheading the snake, to use an old adage of Hezbollah. Obviously, Nasrallah is gone, and so are many senior members of Hezbollah. So I don't see that. It's not Hamas. Hamas is still there. They've got a few senior figures loitering around, I think, parts of Gaza. But my point is, the less Israel has in terms of multiple fronts to deal with, I think benefits Netanyahu. I also think the elephant in the room, or orangutan, if you want to reference him like that, is Trump. I think Israel are, tacitly wanting to be on the right side for when Trump comes in, because Trump is incredibly, there's no question of where he sits on the Israel-Palestine / Iranian dynamics there. And I think Israel wants to sort of be in a position to help Trump with one of his policy targets in the Middle East. And I don't think being bogged down in Lebanon is going to help with that.
Well, now it looks like there is a conflict happening in Syria as well. Just developing. Syria rebels launched biggest attack in nearly 5 years, at least 27 civilians killed. This is dated today, just updated 1 hour ago. Fighting in northwestern Syria over the last 3 days has killed 27 civilians, including 8 children, a UN official said on Friday. Some of the worst violence in years between the Syrian government forces and rebels. Rebels led by the Islamist militant group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, sorry if I'm saying this right, launched an incursion on Wednesday into a dozen towns and villages in the northwestern province of Aleppo. Are they related? What's going on in Syria and the ceasefire in Lebanon?
No, they're not directly related. I think they're related in the sense that the Middle East has been, it has never been in such an unprecedented amount of turmoil all at once. Cast your minds back to what we've seen this year: 2 direct attempted strikes on Israel by Iran, and the 2 basically going head to head. The scenarios that so many military analysts, of which I'm not one, but geopolitically speaking as well, have been fearing from decades. It is relevant in the sense that Syria is still in a state of arguably perpetual conflict. Assad has largely come out on top because he wasn't overthrown, and Putin has re-established his legitimacy. He was allowed into the Arab League last year. So Syria, sort of the Assad government regime, has been re-legitimized in some ways. But the rebels, if you want to call them that, the pro-Western aligned entities, have been still there. They've been around Idlib in the northwest for a longer period, a pocket. But they've always been pushing and pressuring certain other settlements, including Aleppo, which is historically very important. But again, the bigger element here is Trump, because he's made it very clear he wants to pull any and all US presence out of areas that he doesn't consider strategically relevant. And that would be Syria, that would be Iraq. But I think where this plays in, whether you could argue maybe there's a bit of connect, is obviously Iran. The Tehran is still very potent, despite what its strikes on Israel have revealed about its deterrence tactics. but Iran still has many fingers in pies, and like they've been influencing Iraq through the Badr organization and a couple of other entities. You know, they're omnipresent. Would I say they're directly behind what's wrong in this element now? No, but it's all interconnected, and I think, you know, putting it in the big picture of when Trump comes in, I think his target policy number one is Iran in the Middle East, right? That's who he wants. He wants to go maximal pressure. He wants to upscale sanctions, and he wants Israel to be his sort of, you know, entity in the region to help him facilitate American interests, to protect American interests, whilst he goes focuses on China.
Trump said this before the election. Trump told Netanyahu apparently that he wants Gaza war over by the time he enters office. He is putting some pressure on Israel to end the war that they're engaged in. I wonder how the Israeli foreign policy could change course on inauguration day.
It's a good point. I think that's partially maybe why they are beginning to draw down in Lebanon, or intend to.
Well, let's back up. Well, what leverage does the United States have over the IDF and the Israeli foreign policy? What tools do they have to persuade Netanyahu to end wars?
About $4 billion of military aid a year.
Makes sense.
Well, no, I mean, you know, whether or not you want to say that the Trump administration are going to drastically leave Israel high and dry, I don't think so. But Trump and Netanyahu have a decent relationship. I think they've been combative at times. I'm not too familiar with their personal relations. It's a bit hazy, obviously, considering everything else at the moment. But the US has a few ways it can pressure. Now, it's more whether or not they're willing to go to that extent. As you could see under the Biden administration, they tried very hard to pressure that ceasefire in Gaza multiple times. They've pressured Israel to focus on, you know, getting the hostages out and you know, not continuing to blanket Gaza with missiles and such. But the Bibi government have basically completely disregarded them, and that's because they are one of the most right wing in Israel's history, and Trump is obviously more that way leaning than Biden. But you know, does that mean because you've got, maybe Trump will try to come up again with transactional offers? You know, we'll do X if you begin to explore elements of peace, or at least ceasefire with the, you know, Hamas. But what I would say as an endpoint on this is also, you know, Trump wants to finish the pinnacle of his foreign policy, arguably achievement from his first time, which was the Abraham Accords. He wants to add the cherry on top, which is the Saudi Arabia Israeli normalization. MBS, you know, bin Salman is obviously, I think, more favored that Trump's in office now, and I think that they want to formalize those ties officially, and they will need, you know, the war in Gaza to be sort of somewhat altered, or the situation to change. Also, again, because it's all coming back to is Iran and how you have this collective sort of force deterrent towards Iran. So I don't, you know, if you scratch my back, you know, you negotiate a ceasefire, then we'll help you secure your relations with Saudi Arabia and improve Israel's overall standing amongst the Middle East.
Bottom line, Pyotr, based on your research and analysis, how likely is it that we will get more peace, more ceasefires, more deals in the Middle East by inauguration?
Well, you're really emphasizing the 20th of January, don't you? I don't know. It's really hard to say.
Well, that's what Trump said. We're evaluating whether or not he could do what he said on the campaign trail. So, I mean, you can extend the timeline if you like, if you think it's, you know, more realistic to do so.
Well, yeah, no, I think you should extend the timeline, simply put. Do I think that he can secure peace in some shape or form? Yes, gradually. Okay. But not necessarily just by January 20th, right? He's got a lot of other issues. And to paraphrase a very good podcast I was listening to recently, right? Trump will forego the geopolitical implications if it means he can get good economic deals. He's a businessman ultimately, and he is a transactional he hosts transactionality. And there's another good example I would emphasize, which can lead us into the China aspect, which is that you have two sort of approaches to foreign policy since the end of the Second World War, the Yalta and the Helsinki. And Trump is a Yalta man through and through, which basically means he believes in the idea that great powers, Russia, China, the US, determine the fate and sort of interests of smaller powers. He's not a guy like Biden who is multilateralist, Helsinki, that, smaller powers have as much at the table in terms of a say. So he will be looking at the bigger entities. And if it means giving a few concessions away so that he can ultimately achieve his economic targets and benefits for US interests, both economic and strategic, then he will do that. So if it means that Palestine is still being, in the situation that it is, I don't think Trump's going to give two monkeys. I'm sorry to say, but it's not a priority for him. His priority is Iran and Israel vis-a-vis US interests.
Is it still going to be Iran? Let's take a look at China and the trade war. Well, broadly speaking, the trade war overall. Take a look at what happened with the tariffs situation this week, and I do want to talk about China and US in particular. So earlier this week, Trump threatened 25% tariffs on goods coming from Mexico and Canada, and an additional 10% on goods coming from China. He said the duties were a bid to clamp down on drugs and illegal immigration. Already, we're seeing responses from Mexico and Canada. To one tariff will follow another in response, and so on until we put our common businesses at risk, says Claudia Scheinbaum. Okay, how do you think China is going to respond this time? They've had years of preparation. It's happened to them last time. They know what to do. What will they do?
Well, what I think is interesting is to sort of frame my response initially is that the biggest area of continuity you've seen between the Biden and Trump administration is over China, right? Trump largely started this trade war with the Chinese, and Biden has taken that and refined it, what's known as, high fence, small yard approach, by focusing on advanced industries, the CHIPS Act, Inflation Reduction Act, all these sorts of things were aiming at to contain or limit China's ability to influence or affect US interests like that. Now, Trump's probably not going to be quite as refined, and I think he's going to blanket 200% tariffs on EVs. He's going to add an additional 10% of tariffs on top, make it 60% tariffs against China, as well as the, 10 to 20% across the board for every nation state, regardless if they're allies or adversaries or whatever. But the Chinese have also made interesting measures. Now, you could argue this is more about domestic issues, but I also would counter argue that it's as much about also precautionary efforts, which is they released a $1.4 trillion debt package to ease fiscal constraints and stabilize economic growth on about 2.5 weeks ago. And that's to do, I think, with basically they're making it debt easier to be increased for local governments because China has a quite complicated and not ideal structure between its local governments and administrations. If you remember that fire that happened in late 2022 that caused the white paper rebellions across the country, that was basically the poor administrative management of local Chinese governments led to them not knowing that this was the situation. So I think China has already made quite a few retaliatory measures as well as sort of protectionist measures against its economy. But does that mean it's not still going to feel the squeeze? No. China is facing significant economic headwinds even prior to Trump coming in. The demographic crisis, whilst, I don't want to overblow it, but one estimation as a demographer I read a lot into, they reckon that the Chinese population could actually decrease by 50 million by 2030. So China has structural problems. Again, I'm not going to be one of those people who overblows and says China's imminent collapse, but the trade war with Trump is a big headache for Xi. And why I think he is suddenly getting quite interested in the BRICS even more than usual, and other countries that he can at least try to soften the blow. There's nothing to replace the intrinsic strategic relationship and reliance the two have economically, as in the US and China.
Well, this is what I wanted to touch on when you said that Iran is a central focus, or will be the central focus of Trump. And I wanted to ask you if that will still be the case come Inauguration Day, because take a look at this site. This is from the State Department circa 2017 to 2021. Right, Department of State. This is an archived page during the first Trump presidency. It says here, this is the official government from the U.S. state. The Chinese Communist Party poses the central threat of our times, undermining the stability of the world to serve its own hegemonic ambitions. Despite efforts to defend its malign actions, the People's Republic of China, under the control of the CCP, is not a model world citizen. Dominated by General Secretary Xi Jinping, the CCP is expanding its power and influence at the expense of others in at least 6 ways. I'm not going to read the rest of it, but it goes on to list a bunch of things. Okay, this is very strong language from the past Trump administration. Obviously, this is an archived page. It's different now. Will this kind of attitude towards China still persist in the second Trump administration, do you think?
I would bookmark that page and check if it's unarchived in a couple of months, because I don't think much is going to change, right? To be very clear, when I said that Iran is going to be a foreign policy focus for Trump, I meant in the sense of in very much by and way through it.
Sure.
China is Trump's foreign policy focus. It's China. He doesn't want Ukraine in the picture. He doesn't need the headaches. Russia's not for him as big a deal. It's China because, again, he's a businessman. He's about economics. The geopolitical stuff for him is a nuisance. He doesn't want it. He wants to make money, or he wants to better, US manufacturing and economic prosperity. That's what he's about. So China is his foreign policy focus. Of course, it might ebb and flow a little bit, but largely speaking, he's going to look through the lens of what is Beijing doing behind the scenes here, X, Y, and Z, right? If he suddenly gets interested in Latin America for some reason, it's probably because he's also wondering whether the Chinese are active through Venezuela or Nicaragua or some other, entity that's more aligned there. So no, I personally think that rhetoric is just going to continue. Very hawkish when it comes to China. Trump has made no qualms that they look at what academics and international relations call wolf warrior diplomacy, which is that since Xi took over, China has been much more willing and confident in asserting its national interests, particularly over Taiwan. We host a lot of talks on my show about Taiwan and a possibility of some kind of military campaign. If it were to happen, the window is quite small and specific.
Yeah.
And as I said, China's got its own issues to deal with, but so does America. And the debt crisis is a huge problem for the American economy right now. And given the, monetary relationship between those two and what he owns of each, I certainly think those two want to avoid something. But if Trump thinks he can get away with upping the ante in terms of trade and coercive diplomacy, i.e. through sanctions, right? Trump seems to think that tariffs are the best form of economic statecraft, that they can be leveraged to either incentivize or punish states into doing what he wants. And I think that his overutilization, over-reliance on them might come back to bite him. Wow. Sure, you might see some countries eventually capitulate. The Canadians, the Mexicans might, although we're seeing some resistance from the new leader in Mexico, they might align a little bit, make concessions. But the thing about Trump is he gets very riled up, but once he realizes or notices that he is going to get some kind of concession, even if it's more about the image, look at what happened with North Korea and South Korea, right? Yeah. That didn't actually lead to any improvement, but it looked great on paper for Trump. So if he can get some kind of concessions from Beijing, then he might back off. But I'm still hesitant about that. And I think if people who are watching this for obviously their financial and personal interests like that, then be sure to hedge and protect yourself against that trade war.
So final question before we go, more tariffs or not? Can we expect that?
Oh, yeah. It's just more about in what capacity. Yeah. I mean, I'll use Europe as a case study very quickly, right? I think for people who are interested in trade policy and that sort of thing, like Forex as well, anything like that, you must watch the transatlantic relationship because Europe is not ready for, defending against Russia and conflict, but they're also making tentative, but not enough in many people's eyes, retaliatory measures against US. And so if you've got a trade war that begins between the European Union and the US, where how much financial flows are there and economic, exchange of goods and services, that's not going to be good. I mean, last anecdote I'll share is that people are actively, I've got friends who are moving over from the US to get jobs here, right? They're taking pay cuts, but it's because you've got more and more employers of large MNCs who are more willing now to hire in Europe for Americans and pay the additional costs of visas because they know that there's going to be so many labor market risks potentially under the Trump administration. So it's going to get messy.
Excellent talk, Pyotr. Well, before we go, tell us about your work, where we can find you. You have a wonderful geopolitical channel on YouTube, the Global Gambit. It's very popular and it's growing in popularity every day. So congratulations on that. People should check that out. Link down below. What do you cover? What can we expect from your channel?
Yeah, no, thanks, David. It's been an absolute pleasure. You know, your channel's been an inspiration. I always like to come and join you for these far-ranging conversations that hopefully stay on topic. But yeah, I've refined my channel a little bit to be at the nexus of like geopolitics, but also the global macro outlook, not just sort of talking about geopolitics for geopolitics' sake, but what does it mean tangibly for the flow of trade, for finances, commodities and such. And we do touch upon Ukraine a lot, but I also cover all sorts of things like Brazil, BRICS, Africa, and so on, and host a wide array of guests from McKinsey to Deloitte to LSE and a bunch of other humanitarian organizations. So if that's of interest, I welcome people to join and share their perspectives as well.
Well, definitely link down below. Follow Pyotr Kurzin there, and we'll speak again soon. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, David.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.